Hey guys, welcome back to BanQ's regulatory deep dives. Unfortunately, no tiny microphone today. Left it at home. I'll have it in the next video. I know you all miss it a ton. But today we're going to be diving into top due diligence regulations to know around the globe. And we'll specifically hone in on the CSDDD as well as the UFLPA. More to come on that. And as a reminder, if you want to receive updates on when these videos come out, to subscribe to our YouTube channel and or follow us on LinkedIn. We post a lot of helpful resources there when it comes to supply chain traceability, sustainability, and regulatory compliance. So let's dive in. The agenda for today, let me move my little face. The agenda for today is we'll, again, kind of go into what global due diligence is, what it means for a supply chain to be compliant with human rights or environmental due diligence, just so we're all on the same page on what that means. And then we'll also look at just a quick cheat sheet of examples of due diligence regulations around the globe. And then, as promised, we will do a deeper dive into the CSDDD and then the UFLPA. The CSDDD being the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, focused on EU-based companies or companies with a large footprint in the EU. And then the UFLPA is strictly a US regulation, but it does affect anyone importing certain goods into the US. And again, we'll get more into that once we get to that slide. And then last but certainly not least, we're going to do a little plug for BanQu. So as a traceability software, what can we offer companies looking to get a handle on their due diligence compliance? So how do we help? How do we support? And then that way, if you're exploring these topics and your company also might be looking for a solution to support with your due diligence, you can reach out and see if we could be a good fit for you. All right. Okay, so what is due diligence, specifically supply chain due diligence? In a nutshell, it is proactive risk management to address the impact your supply chain has on people and planet. So it can be an investigation, an audit, a review. It can be ongoing. It can be sporadic. When we talk about regulatory due diligence, it's truly these regulations that require companies to meet certain requirements in their supply chain operations. And we'll notice a lot of these regulations today seek to address environmental and human rights impacts. So it's looking at regulating, instead of it just being a free-for-all, right? And companies, emitting carbon left and right, and having no idea where their goods come from or whether the people making them are paid, et cetera, et cetera. It's starting to regulate how people do business throughout their supply chain, which I think is actually pretty cool. Cool time to be in this space. So now that we're on the same page, let's just look at, let me move myself up there. Let's look at main human rights due diligence regulations around the globe. So again, we're gonna tackle the UFLPA and then the CSDDD, number 1 and number 10, in the next slides. But this is just a look at how a lot of countries around the world have some sort of law, legislation, or regulation. Now, the requirements might vary. The ones that we're diving into today do have financial and reputational penalties for non-compliance. So basically, if you don't meet the requirements, you can be fined. Others are a little more lenient, and I would say the ones that are more lenient tend to be the laws that have been around longer. So and the reason for that being is it's newer. And so I think the shift that we're seeing in the market is different, like modern slavery acts and whatnot that have been around for some time might be more optional or highly recommended or have standards. But truthfully, not much enforcement happens unless a case is made or a complaint is made. Now, what we're going to see with newer regulations like the CSDDD and the UFLPA, the UFLPA has been around for about 2 years, we're going to see that people are starting, and by people I mean, governments, regulatory bodies are really starting to crack down on global supply chains. So a big takeaway from this slide, we'll go to the next one, I would say is depending on where you do business and where you source your goods from, you're going to want to get really familiar with whether or not they have a human rights or due diligence regulation, just to make sure you're keeping up with supply chain reporting requirements and regulatory requirements. Okay, now for the fun stuff, let's get into the CSDDD. So the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, if you work in supply chain procurement sustainability, it's likely that you've heard of this, especially if you're in the EU or you work for a company that has a pretty big stake in the EU market. So this is essentially a legal framework that companies who are conducting business in the EU, it encourages them to ensure that they have a good handle on the human rights and environmental impacts throughout their operations and supply chains. Who does it affect? So it affects large EU companies. Now, you may remember this used to be even stricter. It did change recently before it was officially passed, this in like last month, I believe. So it'll affect large EU companies with 1,000 or more employees, and that also has a net turnover of 450 million plus euros worldwide. And then it'll eventually affect non-EU companies as well. That will be a slightly different phase. And then smaller suppliers and corporations aren't necessarily in scope when it comes to the legislation. But because of how supply chains and businesses work, and they're so interconnected, and these large EU companies, for example, will likely be, sourcing from other smaller companies or sourcing for certain suppliers, they are also indirectly affected by this because these large EU companies that need to get this due diligence data around the human rights and environmentally friendliness of their supply chains are going to require certain information from those companies that they are sourcing from, or those suppliers supplying them raw materials. So keep in mind that we do talk, hey, it's going to be these large EU companies, but there's been a lot of chatter about, hey, this is going to have some far-reaching effects. So even if you're not directly affected, you might need to look at who your buyers are. Who are you supplying to? Who are you selling raw materials or portions of goods to? And are they going to need information to comply with CSDDD? And the likelihood of it being a yes is pretty big. When it comes to the implementation timeline, so this past spring, summer, we were on the cusp. The final text of the CSDDD was approved. So it is going into, it's live per se. The implementation timeline has begun. This fall, the EU will come out with specifications and tools that will help companies, have a set amount of standards and where they'll put their reporting for this. And then 2024 through 2026 is when the EU member states will begin implementing the CSDDD into their domestic legal frameworks. Now, what we've seen in the past is certain countries might be a little faster at implementing than usual. That typically tends to be, I know for some other regulations like the Netherlands, France, and maybe Germany or the Scandinavian countries, I can't remember, but just keep in mind that different member states might be a little stricter than others, especially if they've led the way with regulations before. And then 2026 to 2027 is when the CSDDD will take effect across the EU. That means it'll not only affect those large EU companies, but also non-EU companies that match those turnover thresholds with the large EU company thresholds. Penalties. So it may slightly depend on the member state because it's up to the member state to reinforce or enforce penalties. but financial penalties include up to 5% of the company's net worldwide turnover, which is huge. And then civil liabilities can also be charged to the company for noncompliance. So that means that if there are any victims of noncompliance, say, along their supply chain, there's someone who's like, hey, they're not upholding these sustainability due diligence standards. Those victims have right to compensation in addition to that 5% of the company's net worldwide turnover. So it's really good to know ahead of time what could happen for noncompliance. Okay, CSDDD versus CSRD. As if we needed any more acronyms, these two are almost the exact same sounding. So just a quick snapshot here. We do have a different video about the CSRD if you would like to go check that out. But the big differences we'll cover right now is the CSDDD. That was on the last slide. The focus is supply chain due diligence. So making sure you can prove that throughout your supply chain, you're taking care of people and planet. You have a handle on human rights and environmental effects. And then the CSRD is all about reporting. So it's not just being able to show like, hey, we do XYZ to mitigate risk. We do XYZ to have supply chain visibility and a handle on what goes on in our supply chain. This is saying like you have to have the data to generate certain sustainability reports. Adoption timelines are similar, and there's definitely some overlap. So the first reports for the first group of the CSRD is January 2025. And then the CSDDD, as we saw, is a very phased in implementation timeline from 2024 to 2026. And then the CSDDD guidelines will be released in the fall. And then for the CSRD, the reporting standards are going to follow the ESRS very closely. And then, of course, there's some overlap, so that'll affect EU and non-EU companies that operate within the EU. There are certain size thresholds. Again, check our CSRD video to learn more. And then there are certain sustainability reporting guidelines and frameworks that can apply to both. But yeah, and then they also have the penalties. So that's huge to remember too. Financial penalties for both for noncompliance. Okay, so that kind of ends our European due diligence snapshot. Now we're going to dive into the UFLPA, which is another big due diligence regulation that is getting a lot of traction, even though it started about 2 years ago. And this one is USA specific. So the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act was signed into law on December 23rd, 2021. So it's been around for 2-ish years. And then it went into effect June 22nd, 2022. So yeah, it's officially actually been 2 years, almost to the day. And it basically prohibits the importation of any goods produced fully or partially in the Xinjiang region of China. The reason for that being is there's a lot of Uyghur Muslim forced labor happening in China, particularly in this region. And so in order for the US government to take a stand against that, crack down, they have decided to stop any importation of goods, raw materials, anything basically coming from that region or that goes through that region in production. So for example, and it goes for anything, any raw material, any good, anything coming from or being partially produced in that region cannot come into the US is basically what that means. Now, high-risk products do include cotton, tomatoes, and polysilicon, which is found in solar panels and batteries. So if you work with any of those raw materials at any point in your supply chain, you import any of that or related products into the US, you need to pay attention to this. You may already know about it, but if you don't, it has been 2 years since it's been around, and we are just starting to see some new traction there. And then, of course, the penalties are fines. You can be fined for this, and then product seizure. So, for example, if I'm importing t-shirts into the US and the cotton in those t-shirts is found to be partially from the Xinjiang region of China or suspected of being from the Xinjiang region of China, and I don't have the data to prove otherwise, all those t-shirts, all those products get thrown out. And I get fined, so that would not be fun. How is it going so far? So it has been 2 years. I think this is a really interesting case study and look into what, if a regulation goes into effect, what's actually happening once that happens? Like, are companies following it? What are the penalties? Initially, a lot of companies were finding loopholes via suppliers or products and just kind of making sure that any type of relation to that region of China was brushed under the rug or a little too complicated to figure out. Or companies were simply deciding to eat the cost of product loss and fines. So they were like, you know what, oops, we'll eat that cost. We'll do better next time. However, in the last few months, earlier this year, there were some huge impacts from the UFLPA on the automotive industry. And so people are starting to really talk and pay attention to this again and look for solutions. You'll also note in this next slide that every month and year since the UFLPA was enacted, companies are losing more and more money from it and losing more and more products from it. So I think if people are like, well, like we've seen a lot more interest peaked in people reaching out to BanQu or just chatter, out in the market, it's in large part because of a recent study that came from the Forced Labor Lab, in which they found that it is so likely that every major car brand from Volkswagen to BMW to Honda, et cetera, is at super high risk for sourcing from companies linked to Uyghur region abuses. And so I think this will be a really big thing, not only for the rest of this year, but in the coming years, even though it's been around for 2 years. So that is worth noting. Okay, a little BanQu plug. So how does BanQu support due diligence? It is a supply chain traceability solution. So essentially it can help you get the data and visibility you need along your supply chain to track and prove supply chain due diligence. So companies use this for all sorts of things, but due diligence is a really big one because it does get you that traceability and data along your supply chain to help you comply with regulations, in addition to just getting you like the supply and ESG data you need to generate internal reports and make more informed business decisions. So whether you need to comply with the CSDDD, the UFLPA, both and more, BanQu can really help you do that. So here's a little snapshot of what we do. Feel free to reach out if you are in the market for a due diligence solution, or if you are looking to learn more about supply chain traceability and what you can do for your business. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, feel free to comment on the video, find me on LinkedIn, Jordan Wilson, shoot me a message. And we have a ton more resources on the BanQu website if you'd like to go read or watch any more. Thank you so much. We'll chat soon.